Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Another episode of Liberty with Love. I am your host, Robin Koerner, and I am excited about the guest on today's show. He was given a rather great title a few years ago by the Foundation for Economic Education, and some of you may know that I'm a faculty member at FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, and I particularly enjoyed the interview, the transcript of the interview that FEE did, the Freeman actually, FEE's magazine, did with Oliver Porter, my guest today. And they put a great title on this interview, The Man Who Outsourced Government. Now, how can you have a liberty-orientated talk show and not talk to the man who outsourced government? It would be impossible. And it's taken me a couple of years to get to speak to him. But Oliver Porter, welcome to Liberty with Love. Thanks for being on the show.
It is a pleasure.
And, and thanks for being someone who walks the talk, who has walked the talk. I think I would just like to hand this immediately over to you so that you can tell the story of how you became the expert, I think that's a fair thing to say, in outsourcing government, how you did it, and what actually that means, both conceptually and practically.
Well, I think your listeners would be interested to know that I have no government background. I came from the corporate world. About a dozen years ago, we were incorporating a new city in Georgia. We had fought for 30 years in the legislature to get permission to just have a vote to form a city, incorporate. City of nearly 100,000 people. It would be the fifth largest city in the state at birth. And we had finally gotten permission to do that. I was asked to be in charge of implementing the city. And I did that. In short, I started the new city of almost 100,000 people with only 2 government employees.
Okay, so now let's give us all the name of the city so that everybody can go and look this up when they have heard about your amazing story. What's the name of the city?
Sure, the city is Sandy Springs, Georgia, and it's become well known around the world, actually.
Okay, so let's tell this story because then we will find out why it's become well known. When you say you started it with 2 government employees, this means that there was a day when it was not incorporated, and then midnight struck, and then you had a whole new city. And how was it that you got to be the man who had to build the thing from scratch? How did you end up in that role?
It's too long a story to tell very well, but I was on a committee, volunteer committee, that had tried, as I said, for almost 30 years to get a bill passed. Unfortunately, no one had really thought about when we actually get it, how are we going to start it? I had asked the question somewhat years earlier, what kind of city would it be? And everyone said, well, we ought to have a charter. So I said, well, how do we do that? They said, we form a charter commission. Why don't you do that? So I had formed a charter commission to draw up what is the authority and what are the responsibilities of this government? How will it be organized? Then for several years, we failed again and again to get our bill passed. And then finally, there was a change of parties in our state in November 2004, and we were suddenly told that our bill would be the first one on the agenda.
Wow.
And we were sort of like the dog that catches the train. But we've got it now. How do we do it? And at that point, because I had drawn up a plan a couple of years earlier for starting the city, sort of on the back of an envelope, they looked at me quickly and said, can you implement that plan? And I said, yeah, given 2 conditions. I need a title. I will be unpaid, but call me the interim city manager And the reason for that was I could get other cities to actually talk to me, mayors and other city managers, if I had some title. And secondly, we have no time left to do this. It's a matter of months. We cannot run this by committee. If you want me to do it, you'll have to give me some free rein to do it. And they sort of reluctantly agreed, but they agreed to that. And suddenly I am now faced with starting a new city of almost 100,000 people in a matter of months. And by the way, when you said at midnight, you're exactly right. Our first council meeting was 1 minute after midnight, December 1st, 2005. And at that moment, they had a fully operational city to run.
Wow. So tell me about those first few days and weeks when you have nothing in place. How did it run? What did and didn't happen?
Well, it became obvious to me because the bill gave no one any authority. In other words, until the moment the city was incorporated, no one could hire anyone. We couldn't buy anything. We couldn't lease anything. So how do you go from no authority, not having anything, to 1 minute later having a fully operational city of almost 100,000 people?
And also,
that
Oliver,
was my challenge.
Just so I'm clear, 1 minute after midnight, 1 minute into the existence of Sandy Springs, presumably there was no bank account, and even if there was no money in it.
There actually was. Okay. One of the things I bid out was our banking business. And as a part of the bid, 6 banks bid on it. And as part of the bid, they had to loan us $10 million on January 1st. And they fell all over themselves to do that. But my decision to basically use private industry to provide all the services was driven by the fact that I could not start a traditional government. There was no way, since I couldn't hire any people, train them, get them on the job, anything in advance of the start of the city. I had to find an alternative, and because of my corporate background, I guess, I knew the kinds of resources that a major company can bring to bear to do work of this type if they can be convinced that it's a worthwhile contract for them. Mm-hmm. So I began the process of trying to identify companies that could do the service for us if they wanted to, and eventually went through a competitive bid process with them. The whole shebang of bidding it out, contracting and everything. So they built the city for us.
So could you,
when I say built the services.
Could you go down the list, please? I mean, more or less, of the main services that from day one you started to put out to tender, basically. What kind of things are we talking about? And which of them are typically put out to the private sector by city governments and which are not? Sure.
This nice coincidence, I was just providing that information yesterday to a venture capitalist fund that I'm advising that's investing in new cities. But let's start. Basic general administration, accounting, purchasing, billing, finance, human resources, your public information, public relations, the information technology. That was a big one. We had to build the entire apparatus for that. We did parks and recreation, transportation, which included traffic design, traffic engineering, as well as road maintenance, community development, and under that title goes planning, zoning, permitting, code enforcement. I'm ticking these off from memory, but I think that's the majority of them. But that's basically the way to describe it is everything except public safety.
Okay, so now that's a really interesting list. Well, a couple of things that kind of stick out. You privatized zoning. Did I get that right?
Yeah, all those.
Now, on what basis did a private entity make determinations, zoning determinations? Because you typically think of that being something, if there's any part of a city that would be democratically controlled, kind of for the good of the community, right? You kind of think of that, right? I mean, that would be one thing you'd think of. It's not obvious that would be privatized.
Sure. I'll explain that. But let me first say I really resist the term privatization.
Okay.
Because that normally connotes a transfer of public assets to private industry. And this was strictly a services contract. There was no transfer of assets. In the long run, the company owned all the assets anyway, but we didn't have to buy buildings or trucks or all that. But coming back to your question, you have to be clear. The staff work for zoning, all the real work is done by the private company. But the final decision with regard to zoning is done by the elected officials. Let me describe how this type of arrangement is both different and similar to an existing bureaucracy.
Now, we've got only 30 seconds left in this segment, so maybe give us a little initial summary, and then we will carry on the details on the other side of the break. Yeah, go ahead.
Normally, there are three levels of government. The elected officials who set policy, budget, and so forth, an administrator who carries out those policies, and the workforce. All we replaced in this was the workforce. Okay.
All right, so we will be going into the break. Hold that thought, listeners. I'm speaking to Oliver Porter, the man that FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, has called the man who outsourced government. We'll be back in a few minutes. This is Robin Koerner, and I'm speaking to Oliver Porter about the outsourcing, in quotes, of the government of the city of Sandy Springs that he was responsible for pretty much getting off the ground from its inception. Oliver, please carry on from where you left off at the end of the segment. Last segment, you were telling us that there are three levels of government: the policymakers, the administrators, and then the on-the-ground workforce, right? And well, why don't I just hand that straight back to you and you carry straight on?
All right. Well, what we did with this public-private partnership basically was simply to replace the workforce with a company. We still have the elected officials, and they still run the city. They make the policy decisions. We still have the city manager or city administrator who carries out that and who now manages the contract. And then all of the workforce is now provided by private industry under contract, competitively bid contract. So you're right. I also would not have wanted to see zoning being done by a private company, but the legwork for carrying out the zoning is done by that, and the final decision still rests with the people it should, the elected officials.
Okay. So you've got all of these services at that third level being done by private companies. Now, is that so different from most cities? Because obviously, there are private companies picking up my trash here. There are building contractors that lay the roads here in Seattle, where I am, et cetera, et cetera. So to what extent was what you were doing different from the average city in Georgia?
It's different in the sense that it is so much more efficient. I have two basic criteria for good government. One is efficiency, and the second is responsiveness. Neither is enough without the other. If you're efficient but you're not giving the people what they want, not good. If you're giving them what they want but it is a very high cost, not good. So what the private industry aspect of this brings to it is both efficiency and a much more responsive government to the needs of the people. I might cut to the chase and tell you the results of Sandy Springs.
Okay, so before you do, though, I want to kind of get a sense of the magnitude of the difference of what you were doing between what you were doing and what is being done in most cities. How many, as I was saying, other cities use private companies to do the work on the ground for a lot of the things that they're responsible for. So it seems that and correct me if I'm wrong here, Oliver, but it seems that the fundamental difference between what you're doing in Sandy Springs and maybe what is done by the governments of other cities is a quantitative difference rather than a qualitative one, right? You were using contracting out over a broader range of government-provided services than another city, but it's not a fundamentally different thing you were doing from what is done in other cities. Have I got that right, or have I got that wrong?
What you said is intuitive, but I think it's wrong.
Go ahead. Correct me. Correct me for the benefit of all the listeners here.
In fact, it is a much greater scope than other cities had done to basically say all of the work other than public safety will be done under a contract. But what it brings to it is a wholly different approach to providing services. All of the bureaucracies that exist, which is basically all of the cities in our country in the past, have built bad behavior into their product. Their employees have low morale. They can't be incented. They can't be disciplined. They can't be fired. We have basically people, and many of them have come to me since we did the city and said how great it was to work in this new environment, because in the past they were told, they'd go to their supervisor and say, "Here, I know a better way to do my job." And basically they were told, just go away and be quiet, until they finally gave up.
Yeah. And
there you have the typical bureaucratic employee. They come to the company possibly in the same job, same person, but the company is begging them for ideas for doing how to do it better. And you know why? There's a thing called a profit motive.
Absolutely. The government doesn't have to earn your money, but the private sector does.
Yeah. So it encourages better workers, basically. It affects the budgetary process. In the typical government, you have departments. Each department head is under pressure to provide more services. That's all the public wants. So he asks for more money. They build a pyramid, in effect, of money in each department, wants more, and eventually it gets to the top, you don't have enough money for it. What happens in these private companies, this department head comes in and says, "I need more money," and they say, "The hell you do. We can find somebody else who can run this job." Right. So it affects the budgetary process. The flexibility that the private company has with moving employees about, and as I said, providing motivation and discipline, lets them use fewer employees because they can move them from spot to spot, job to job better than you can in a staid bureaucracy. A great example of that was in going back to the area you talked about, the community development planning, permitting, that sort of thing. I had set up volunteer task forces to study each area of service we needed, and they were good people and did a good job. And we had calculated that we need to be able to process about 50 building permits a month, and for our area. The first day, the county that had been providing our services dumped 800 permits in our laps very gleefully, which they'd already taken the money for but had not processed. So timeline was short for them, and they thought they had swamped us. Well, the company just brought in extra people. They handled them, and in 60 days they were all gone, and those people were gone. We weren't stuck with extra employees or extra cost. I could go on and on with those types of things. And it's not just manpower, it's expertise. Setting up an information technology or entire computer system for a city of 100,000 people is a complex thing to undertake. But the company brought in experts from around the world to do that. And when the job was done, they were gone. Basically within 90 days, they were gone, and we didn't pay an extra dime for any of that. So the companies bring technology, they bring better management, they bring better morale, they bring better budgeting. I could go on and on with those things.
In what out of that list that you gave me at the top of the show, which are the areas that Sandy Springs was unique or almost unique in admitting the private sector into, right, in service delivery, that are not where other cities don't have private sector involvement? Right, because some of the sectors, all cities have, use private contractors, as I said. So give me an example of where the difference was really made.
Yeah, you could probably find some place where almost any of the services is outsourced, almost. The beauty of this is that all of them are outsourced, and that again gives you that cost sharing, that flexibility. But the ones that I would say that were least apt to be outsourced are the core functions, that being administration, the accounting, the public relations, human resources. Those administrative type functions are rarely ever outsourced. You're more apt to see something like roads.
Yes.
Community development is rarely outsourced. The planning, zoning, permitting functions are rarely outsourced also. So those are the ones primarily that I don't know of other people doing those.
Okay. Now, there's it's not much of an objection, but one objection to running government like this is, that's going to motivate the formation of corrupt relationships between certain officials in government, the ones making the decisions, choosing the contracted companies, and the people in those companies themselves. So we've only got like 30 seconds in this segment now because time is flying here. This is really interesting speaking to you. But maybe we can address that when we come back on the other side of the break, right?
Sure. Just before we break, I'll simply say, no, it's not more corruption. It's a far cleaner form of government. Then I'll tell you why when we come back.
That's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. And that's exactly what I want to talk about in the long upcoming segment on the other side of the break. This is Liberty with Love. My name is Robin Koerner, speaking to Oliver Porter. In 2011, Robin Koerner wrote the article that launched the biggest coalition for Ron Paul's presidential run, called Blue Republican. Now, Stairway Press is pleased to announce the publication of his first book, If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back. Jeffrey Tucker, who wrote the foreword, says brilliant ideas come in effervescent packages. This is a good description of Robin Koerner's provocative work. It's a work of stunning erudition and sincerity. I also happen to agree with it. I've been struggling toward a similar thesis for a good part of my writing career, though I'm certain Robin has gone beyond even my most mature thought. His section on liberty as a realization of a civilization of love truly sweeps me away with its insight and depth. I know that time is short and that people don't read as carefully as they should, but this section deserves close study by every advocate of liberty. It will change the way you think and speak about the topic. We need this book now. Pre-order your personally signed copy of If You Can Keep It at ifyoucankeepit.us. I'm speaking to Oliver Porter about outsourcing government. So, Oliver, when we went into the break there, you said nice and strongly that this is not a recipe for that kind of private-public axis of corruption. So please explain in detail why this is so much less a corrupt system than the typical way a city is run.
Sure, glad to. Generally, when corruption occurs, it's because it's in hiring practices. For instance, someone on the city council has a cousin that needs a job, that sort of thing. The other one is in the letting of contracts, these individual contracts for various things. There can be kickback from those. So those are the major areas of corruption that seem to show up in cities. We basically have built in protections against that. The city council can't hire anyone. The company does it. So there's no path there for anyone, showing favoritism or nepotism or anything else.
Now, when you say the company, this would be the company to whom the city has outsourced the hiring and firing function, right?
Yeah, they have outsourced the entire operation to these folks, right. And so they are responsible for their own hiring and firing, and so there's no city corruption there possible. The second one is the letting of contracts. Once again, part of the contract with the company is that they manage the contract process. Mm-hmm. They don't, for instance, they don't build a new bridge for you. That's a capital program project, but they manage that project for you. And so the city, the elected officials can't become corrupt on that because they don't do the process. They get final decision if you're issuing a major capital contract, but all of the legwork, all of the real work about it has already taken place, and all they can do is either say yes or no.
So is it as
the
if
company, on the other hand, doesn't want to build in corruption because, once again, that cuts into their profit. Right. So it's a fairly foolproof system that doesn't let the normal forms of corruption take place. And we've been very pleased that there have been not a hint of that sort of thing in any of the cities I have helped to get started.
So let me see if I understand this. So we've got the city basically hires what is effectively a general contracting corporation, right? And that corporation would identify other private entities to fulfill the services that the city requires. And then that general contractor, I'm putting in quotes, would then submit the proposals back to the city for voting up and down. Have I got that right, or am I completely out?
No, you're exactly right. I call it a master contractor, general contractor. In Sandy Springs, at the beginning, we had 12 subcontractors under the master contractor. They chose them all.
Okay.
They manage them all. It turns out companies are a lot better at managing subcontractors than cities are to start with. They're in the business. They know how to be sure they're getting a good job and getting a good price on it. So they are the managing contractor. I'm in favor of a single master contract because it gives you that one point of contact for everything. If you had multiple contractors reporting to the city, each one would be saying, well, that's the other guy's job. It falls in the crack. In our situation, we have one set of leaders that we can get our hands around, and they are responsible for us. And by the way, you might be interested, initially it was set as a 6-year contract, but I wrote into the proposal that either party, either the city or the master contractor, could cancel it with 6 months' notice without cause. We didn't like the way they parted the hair, they're gone.
Wow. That sounds kind of radical and great, and it preempts a question I wanted to ask. So that's good. Let me ask you this. How many government workers in the city of Sandy Springs do you have per capita? And how does it compare to a city that is not run like yours?
I mentioned that public safety, that is police, fire, the courts, are outside the contract. And initially we contracted with both the city of Atlanta and the county for some of those services. It took us 6 months to save enough money under this, because this system was saving us enormous money, to start our own police force, which we did. It took us a year to start up our own fire department, which we did. But if you exclude those services and just talk about all other services, all of those I listed, plus 911 and trash pickup and all of that, the city has, I'm ashamed to say, has grown from 2 employees to 6 employees.
Outrageous. Wow. That is amazing. I mean, talk about small government. 6 government employees per about 100,000 population, right?
Right.
That's,
a city that I was looking at out in your area, I think has a little more than 100,000, maybe about 120,000 population, had 800 employees.
Would this be Kent?
Temps? No.
This city, that's not Kent, that's a different one.
Oh, Kent, yes, it would be actually.
It would be Kent. That's fine, you can say that, that's no problem. Okay.
I misunderstood you. And,
my funny accent.
I think that is correct. Don't hold me to that number, but it is in the hundreds. Now our initial police force was 85 people. It has now grown to 135. I compare that to the county that had previously been providing our police, who said they had 4 policemen on duty at any time, meaning with 3 shifts a day, they had assigned 12 people to us. For a city of 100,000, we didn't know how many were there because we could never find that few number. But the day one of our new police force, we brought in 85 great people because that's what we really needed. The response time for, if you called in a burglary, let's say, had been about 22 minutes. Mm-hmm. The national recommended numbers like 4 to 6. We're down below 4 now. I had asked them not to publish that study of 22 minutes because a burglar could hit my house and be in Canada before they got there.
Yeah, truth.
So we now have really adequate police coverage, and we have good fire coverage also. Top fire rating, insurance rating for fire.
Now, I seem to recall from that transcript of the interview you did a few years ago with Freeman, Oliver, that when it came to, and I might not have this exactly right, but when it came to, I guess, assessing the contracts for some of the services or make some decision-making element, that you didn't just have the city officials and administrators involved in that, but you actually had like a board of volunteers. There were some taxpayers involved in those decisions. Have I got that right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, let me tell you what did occur. Part of the bill that was passed provided for the governor to appoint a commission to assist us in forming the city. Unfortunately, it didn't give that commission any power either, any authority. The governor was to appoint 5 people. We had assumed it would be members of our organizing committee. It turned out, being a politician, he appointed 4 people that didn't even live in our city. Yeah. The other 2 that did had nothing to do with the organization, and he appointed me as a 5th person. I was asked to convene the committee on June the 29th. We've got to have a city December 1st. I convened the first meeting, and there were 2 things of importance. One, they elected me chairman because I was the only one on the group who had any clue as to what we were about to do. Mm-hmm. And second, I laid on their desk several inches thick stack of RFPs, requests for proposals, bid proposals. And I said, Nancy Pelosi wise, you have to pass these without reading them. But the difference was I said, we can change them as soon as you finish reading them. They were, at least, if not in an experienced group, they were a smart group, and they did pass them. And the next morning I issued those requests for proposals to private companies around the country. It was at that point only 4 months until we had to have a city formed.
Mm. Wow, okay.
Now, let me finish answering the question. The selection process then was run by the Governor's Commission. I appointed a group of volunteer people, but people who had business experience, both in the issuing of RFPs and in the responding to RFPs. So we had really knowledgeable people, not elected officials with little knowledge of what they were doing, who did the selection process. And again, it was free of any sort of problem, because there was no one there who had anything vested in making the selection. These were independent experts making the selections. Yeah. They did a wonderful job. We then had to go through a final contract negotiation. We actually didn't report out the selection of the contractor to the Governor's Commission until September 29th, meaning there was only 2 months left to actually get the city started, and we hadn't even that was the first. They approved that, although they could not approve it. They could only approve our report and recommend it to the future council, which would be seated at 1 minute after midnight on December 1st. Right. So it was an interesting process, but through it, by working closely with the company, we were able to start up this new city on time.
We've got 5 minutes left in this segment, so I want to get to a really important part of this story. And you kind of mentioned it at the beginning, and then we went off in a different direction. Let's talk money. Let's talk savings. You use the word efficiency. How much does this save Sandy Springs, the city, and the taxpayers?
Yeah, that's a question that everyone asks in general. And by the way, I have helped start another 9 cities around Atlanta since that time, who followed pretty much the model, and worked with cities around the country and even internationally on converting to this model. And everyone wants to know that. And generally, the savings are in about the 10 to 40% range. Now, in Sandy Springs, we had budgeted, and we had some very good, again, task force work done on creating a budget by going to other cities of like size and other counties and stuff to try to estimate what our costs would be. We had budgeted for about $50 million. The bid came in at $29.5 million. And now that overstates it, because about $5 million of those dollars were costs the company had spent without a contract to start our city, that we were we were required to reimburse them for. So on an ongoing basis, we're looking at about $24.5 million contract to do what we had believed would cost us $50 million. Those kinds of costs have been borne out in other locations. I shouldn't go out on a limb like this, but I scanned this afternoon just because I knew you were going to call the Kent budget. And for that what I call basket of services, that list of services that I indicated earlier that we do provide in Sandy Springs and these other cities, I've developed data that shows what the cost per capita is for doing these types of contracts based on actual contracts that have been let. And for that basket of services, it appeared to me that Kent is spending about $90 million a year. The current contract for Sandy Springs, which is just slightly smaller than Kent, but very much is the current contract's about $17.5 million.
So that massive difference is largely down to inefficiency, bureaucratic overhead, bad incentives, et cetera, would you say? Yeah,
and again, that was just a quick scan of their budget. I wouldn't want to stand on those numbers, but I'm convinced, and by the huge number of employees they have, that the savings over, say, a 5-year contract could probably approach half $500 million.
Now, we've only got 2.5 minutes now left in this long third segment, but yeah, the obvious question when you come to think about making a transition is the resistance you get from the currently entrenched interests, both the city administrators, unions, and some of the representatives with their political ideologies. Have you tried to make this kind of change in a city like Kent, but there are many others, where you've got to sweep away the old to get the new, and you've dealt with that resistance?
Yeah, I've tried a number of times, but it's very difficult. I'm often asked, isn't it harder to convert a city than to start one? And the answer is absolutely not. It's much more complex to start one from scratch. There's only really one problem with converting a city, and it's a thing called politics. Existing elected officials are scared to stick their necks out, no matter how good it might be for their citizens. They are elected under one system, and they're very comfortable there, and they don't want to make a change. So a recent county I was working with, a very poor county, desperately needed something. I didn't think I could even get a company to bid on them, but I did. I got 7 companies to bid. They produced a contract that produced absolutely 10% savings over a very poor budget to start with. It was voted down 4-3, and one of the commissioners who voted against its reason was, well, we've been doing it this way for 100 years. I don't see no reason to change now. And that's the kind of mentality we deal with.
Even though, I mean, when you're talking about savings of 10 to 40%, if you say to folks, certainly in a district like mine, that's your property taxes. You're talking hundreds of dollars there. Does that not, scratch where it itches for voters?
Well, it would for voters, but again, you're not dealing with the voters. You're dealing with
the story never gets told,
a body of elected officials who are able to somehow slide by, cheating their voters year in and year out of a more efficient government.
Yeah.
And clearly employees are concerned. They're concerned about their jobs. That's right and natural. But I'll tell you more about that in a minute. All
right, great. We are going into the last break. We will be back soon. Oliver, we cut you off there at the end of the last segment. We've only got a couple of minutes to the end of the show, so I just want you to carry straight on whatever thought was in your head.
Okay. Well, again, employees, I can understand their concern, but they should know that in most cases, 80 to 90% of them will be retained. The company wants good employees. If you're deadwood, you're gone. So maybe you can have something to work, but otherwise you're going to have a better job, better opportunities, better training, all of that goes with it, and you shouldn't be afraid of it if you're a person who can carry a load. So that's a hurdle that we have to get past, and obviously unions are a problem with that, but we have to. That's what we need: good leadership in cities to step up and say, "Hey, this is a better opportunity for our people." Let me tell you how much better it is. I mentioned the two factors, either efficiency and responsiveness. In terms of efficiency, financial, after the first 10 years, Sandy Springs had not raised taxes 1 mil. Not a mil. Right through the recession, when other companies, other cities were getting in so much trouble, some going bankrupt, didn't raise taxes at all. Were able to carve out 20% of the operating budget for capital expenditures. New roads, new parks, some national award-winning parks, new sidewalks, all of that. So no increase in taxes, major capital expenditures, and build a surplus of $45 million, which was about, at that point, the size of our annual budget, and had zero, and mark this one now, zero long-term debt and unfunded liabilities for pensions, none. And we will not have any pension liabilities building up because of the system we put in place.
That's amazing.
It is that latter thing that has taken cities into bankruptcy all over the country, particularly the unfunded liabilities for pensions. So I don't know how you can beat that record. We have a AAA bond rating, which is unheard of for a new city. I am told, and I don't know this, I am told there are only about 24 in the country that have that. So it's a great system.
It truly is. And Oliver, thank you so much for being on the show to tell us about it. Oliver Porter, thank you. This is Liberty with Love.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.